Close your eyes. Imagine, if you will, the world as it existed 30,000 years ago. There are no city lights to dim the brilliance of the Milky Way, no hum of engines, no distant sirens, and no medicine cabinets filled with glass bottles and plastic blister packs. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke from a dying hearth. You are wrapped in the thick, heavy hide of a bison, lying on a bed of dried ferns, deep within the limestone embrace of a cave. Outside, the wind howls across the steppe, a reminder of the raw, untamed power of the Pleistocene. In this silence, the heartbeat of humanity was steady, but it was also vulnerable. How did we get here? How did our ancestors, without the knowledge of bacteria, the precision of lasers, or the miracle of antibiotics, manage to not only survive, but to thrive, to migrate across continents, and to build the foundations of everything we know today? Before we journey into the depths of the ancient forests and the secrets of the first healers, I have a question for you to ponder as you listen. If you were suddenly transported back to the Stone Age and could bring only one single item from a modern pharmacy, just one, what would it be? Would it be a simple bottle of aspirin, a life-saving inhaler, or perhaps a tube of antiseptic cream? Let me know in the comments below. It's fascinating to think about which piece of our modern world we consider most essential when the comforts of the 21st century vanish. There is a common misconception that life in the deep past was, as the philosopher Thomas Hobbes once put it, nasty, brutish, and short. We often hear that the average lifespan was a mere 25 or 30 years. But this statistic is a trick of the numbers, heavily skewed by high infant mortality. If a child survived the perils of their first few years, they often lived into their 60s, 70s, or even 80s. They were not fragile. In many ways, the human body of 30,000 years ago was a more robust, finely tuned machine than the one we inhabit today. Our ancestors were the elite athletes of the natural world. Their bones were denser, their muscles more resilient, and their senses, sight, smell, hearing, were sharpened to a razor's edge. Survival in a world without medicine began with the body itself. Long before the first herb was crushed or the first wound was stitched, evolution was our primary physician. Our ancestors possessed an immune system that was constantly trained by the environment. In the modern world, we live in environments that are often too clean, leading to a rise in allergies and autoimmune conditions. But the Paleolithic human lived in a symbiotic relationship with the old friends, the microbes, bacteria, and even parasites that had co-evolved with us for millions of years. This internal ecosystem, the microbiome, was the first line of defense. It was a complex shield protecting the gut and the skin from more dangerous pathogens. But even the strongest body faces injury and illness. Imagine a hunter tracking a deer through a dense thicket. A slip on a wet stone leads to a jagged gash on the leg. In a world without stitches or rubbing alcohol, this could be a death sentence via infection. Yet we find evidence in the fossil record of healed fractures and recovered trauma that suggest a deep, intuitive understanding of care. The first medicine was perhaps not a substance but an element: fire. Fire was the great purifier. Long before Joseph Lister pioneered antiseptic surgery in the 19th century, early humans were using heat. They learned that meat cooked over a flame was less likely to cause the agonizing cramps of food poisoning. They learned that water from a spring was safer, but water heated by hot stones was better. Fire provided warmth, which prevented the creeping lethality of hypothermia during the long, dark winters of the Ice Age. But fire was also a tool for the mind. The psychological comfort of the hearth, the way the flickering amber light drove back the terrors of the dark, lowered stress levels and promoted the release of oxytocin and dopamine. A calm mind heals a body faster than a panicked one. This was the birth of the placebo effect in its most primal form, the belief in safety as a catalyst for recovery. As the millennia rolled by, the human gaze turned toward the plant kingdom. Our ancestors did not have chemistry sets, but they had the ultimate laboratory, the world around them. They observed the animals. They saw a sick bear dig for specific roots, or a wounded wolf lick its injuries with a saliva that we now know contains mild antibacterial properties. This is called zoopharmacognosy, the process by which animals self-medicate. Early humans, being masters of observation, took note. One of the most profound discoveries was the willow tree. If you have ever taken an aspirin to dull a headache, you are using a synthetic version of a remedy that is tens of thousands of years old. The bark of the willow contains salicin, a chemical precursor to salicylic acid. Our ancestors discovered that chewing on this bitter bark or brewing it into a tea could break a fever and soothe the throbbing ache of a joints worn down by miles of walking. They didn't know the molecular structure of salicin, but they knew the feeling of the pain receding, the cooling of the blood as the fever broke. Imagine a group of gatherers moving through a meadow in what is now modern-day France. They are looking for more than just calories. They are looking for the quiet plants. They find yarrow, a flowering herb with feathery leaves. When crushed into a pulp and pressed into a bleeding wound, it acts as a styptic, narrowing the blood vessels and encouraging clotting. In the language of the ancients, this was magic. In the language of science, it was the application of alkaloids and tannins. To the wounded hunter, it was the difference between returning to the tribe or bleeding out in the tall grass. And then there was the miracle of the bee. Honey is perhaps the oldest medicine in the human toolkit that remains virtually unchanged today. It is a biological anomaly, a substance that never spoils. Archaeologists have found pots of honey in ancient tombs that are still technically edible. For the early human, honey was more than a rare golden treat. It was a powerful antiseptic. When applied to a burn or a cut, honey creates a barrier against the air. Its high sugar content and low pH levels draw moisture out of bacteria, effectively dehydrating and killing them. It also contains trace amounts of hydrogen peroxide. The sweet healer was a staple of the prehistoric medicine bag, a way to seal the body against the invisible demons of decay. But what of the deeper mysteries? What happened when the illness was not a cut or a fever, but something internal, something that seemed to attack the very soul? This is where the role of the shaman, the first doctor, emerged. In the flickering shadows of the cave, the shaman was the bridge between the physical and the spiritual. They used music, rhythmic drumming, and chanting to induce trance states. While this might seem like superstition to a modern observer, it served a vital medical purpose. These rituals triggered the body's parasympathetic nervous system, reducing the fight or flight response and allowing the body to redirect its energy towards cellular repair. The shaman was also the keeper of the oral pharmacopoeia. Without writing, medical knowledge was stored in song and story. A rhyme might describe which berry was a gift and which was a curse. A story about a legendary ancestor might contain instructions on how to set a broken bone using bark splints and resin. This was the dawn of medical education. It was personal, it was communal, and it was deeply rooted in the landscape. We must also consider the physical environment of the early human. Their medicine was also their lifestyle. They did not sit in chairs for 8 hours a day. They moved in complex, varied ways that kept their lymphatic systems, the body's waste disposal unit, functioning at peak efficiency. They did not consume refined sugars that trigger inflammation. Their diets were rich in wild greens, lean proteins, and complex fibers that nurtured a diverse and protective gut microbiome. Their sleep was dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, aligning their circadian rhythms with the natural world, which optimized the release of melatonin and growth hormones necessary for tissue regeneration. In this first part of our journey, we see that survival was not a matter of luck, but of a profound, interwoven relationship between the human body, the watchful mind, and the generous earth. The early humans were not waiting for modern medicine to begin their quest for health. They were already practicing it, one herb, one fire, and one ritual at a time. But as the populations grew and the climate shifted, new challenges arose. Injuries became more complex and the first surgeries began to take place, some so daring and successful that they defy modern belief. How did a Stone Age person survive a hole being drilled into their skull? How did they manage the agony of childbirth without an epidural? And what happened when the first great plagues began to whisper through the trees? As the fire in our imaginary cave burns lower and the shadows stretch longer across the stone walls, we prepare to move deeper into the history of survival. The journey is long and the path is winding, but every step our ancestors took is a step that led to us. Stay with me as we breathe in the cool air of the past and listen to the echoes of the first healers. In the next part, we will explore the terrifying yet fascinating world of prehistoric surgery and the incredible resilience of the human spirit when faced with the ultimate test of physical endurance. We will look at the tools made of flint and obsidian, sharper than any steel scalpel, and the strange, effective ways the ancients dealt with the most broken parts of themselves. For now, let the rhythm of the ancient world settle over you. Feel the strength of the bison hide, the safety of the stone, and the wisdom of the willow. You are a descendant of survivors. You are made of the same stardust and the same indomitable will that kept the hearth fires burning through the longest nights of history. The fire has now settled into a deep, glowing bed of embers, casting a soft, rhythmic pulse of light against the cave walls. The shadows dance, mirroring the movement of the spirits our ancestors believed inhabited every rock and tree. We have spoken of the immune system and the herbs of the field, but now we must turn our attention to something more visceral, something that challenges our modern assumptions about the primitive mind. we must talk about the first surgeons. Imagine for a moment the sheer courage it would take to perform a medical procedure using only the tools provided by the earth: flint, obsidian, and a steady hand guided by generations of whispered wisdom. One of the most astonishing discoveries in the history of bioarchaeology is the practice of trepanation. In sites scattered across the globe, from the sun-drenched valleys of Peru to the windswept plains of Europe, archaeologists have unearthed human skulls dating back over 5,000 years, and in some cases much further, that bear a distinct intentional hole. This was not the result of a violent blow or a predator's tooth. These holes were carefully scraped, bored, or cut into the living bone. To our modern ears, this sounds like a ritual of madness or a desperate, agonizing punishment. But the bone tells a different story. When we look at these skulls under a microscope, we see something miraculous: smooth, rounded edges where the bone has begun to grow back. This is the unmistakable signature of healing. It tells us that the patient did not just survive the procedure, they lived for years, sometimes decades afterward. But why would an ancient healer attempt such a daring feat? They lacked anesthesia, they lacked sterilized steel, and they lacked a formal understanding of neurology. Yet they understood the concept of pressure. They saw a hunter fall and strike his head, watched as he drifted into a stupor, or suffered from agonizing demons of the mind, what we would now call a subdural hematoma or a severe migraine. They used obsidian, a volcanic glass that can be flaked to an edge so sharp it is literally molecularly thinner than the finest modern surgical scalpel. With rhythmic, patient precision, the healer would work, perhaps while the tribe chanted to drown out the sound, or while the patient was held in a trance-induced state by the smoke of certain herbs. This was the birth of neurosurgery. It was a testament to the human refusal to let a loved one suffer, a willingness to push the boundaries of what was possible to save a life. It reminds us that the primitive brain was just as capable of complex problem-solving as our own. They simply had a different set of tools. But medicine was not always about such dramatic interventions. Much of survival was found in the quiet, daily acts of maintenance. Consider the bones of our ancestors. Life in the Paleolithic was physically demanding. There were falls from rocky ledges, encounters with powerful animals, and the constant strain of traversing hundreds of miles on foot. In the fossil record, we find numerous examples of well-set fractures. A femur, or an arm bone, that was once snapped in two shows evidence of being perfectly aligned and fused back together. How was this achieved? Without X-rays, the ancient healer had to rely on the sight in their fingers. They would feel the break through the skin, manipulating the limb with a deep understanding of anatomy until the bones clicked into place. A process we still use today called reduction. To keep the limbs still, they turned to the earth. They used splints made of sturdy bark or straight branches, bound tightly with strips of leather or sinew. In some cultures, they used a precursor to the modern plaster cast, a thick slurry of river clay and reeds that would bake hard in the sun or by the warmth of the fire, immobilizing the limb for the weeks required for the body to knit itself back together. This brings us to a fundamental truth about ancient survival that is often overlooked in our individualistic modern world. Compassion was a form of medicine. There is a famous find in the Shanidar cave in Iraq, the remains of a Neanderthal known as Shanidar I. This individual lived approximately 45,000 years ago, and his skeleton tells a story of incredible hardship. He had suffered a massive blow to the side of his head that likely left him blind in one eye. His right arm was withered and had been amputated or broken off at the elbow. He had severe arthritis and a healed fracture in his foot. By all the harsh laws of nature, Shanidar I should have died young. He could not hunt, he could not move quickly, he could not defend the tribe. And yet his bones show that he lived to be 40 or 50 years old. This means that for decades his community chose to care for him. They brought him food, they carried him when the tribe moved, and they protected him from predators. They valued his presence, perhaps for his memory, his stories, or simply because he was one of them. This social medicine, the act of communal care, was perhaps the most effective survival strategy we ever developed. It allowed the sick and injured time to heal, a luxury that a solitary animal never has. As we continue to observe the tribe through the mists of time, we see the women gathered near the water's edge. Childbirth was and remains one of the most perilous moments in the human experience. In a world without hospitals, the survival of the species rested on the shoulders of the midwives, the elder women who carried the blood knowledge of generations. They knew which positions eased the labor, utilizing gravity rather than fighting against it. They knew how to use the mother herbs. They might use motherwort to calm the racing heart of a frightened girl, or raspberry leaf to tone the uterus. If the bleeding was too heavy after the birth, they had learned to use shepherd's purse or the astringent properties of oak bark to help the vessels contract. But more than the herbs, they provided the doula effect, the continuous emotional support that modern science has proven significantly reduces complications and pain. The ancient birth was not a clinical event. It was a communal rite of passage, surrounded by the familiar faces and voices of the village. And what of the invisible enemies? The infections that can turn a small scratch into a lethal fever? The ancient world was full of natural antibiotics that we are only now beginning to rediscover through the lens of science. One of the most fascinating is the use of sphagnum moss. During the First World War, when cotton was scarce, nurses turned to this moss to dress wounds. But our ancestors had been using it for millennia. Sphagnum moss is naturally acidic and contains compounds that inhibit the growth of bacteria. It is also incredibly absorbent, drawing moisture and toxins away from a wound while keeping the environment sterile. They also looked to the fungi. When the famous Iceman, Otzi, was discovered frozen in the Alps after 5,000 years, he was found carrying a leather pouch containing specific types of birch polypore fungus. This fungus contains agaric acid, which acts as a natural laxative and has powerful antiparasitic properties. It is highly likely that Otzi was using this fungus to treat the whipworms that were found in his digestive tract. He was carrying a portable medicine cabinet, a carefully curated selection of the Earth's pharmacy, designed to keep him moving through the brutal mountain passes. The ancient humans also understood the importance of the internal fire. They knew that a body that was cold and damp was a body that would soon fall ill. They used the sweat lodge or primitive saunas, enclosures where water was poured over heated stones to create a thick, cleansing steam. This was not just for hygiene, it was a way to induce a temporary fever. By raising the body's temperature, they were artificially stimulating the immune response, helping the body to burn out the lingering ghosts of a winter cold or the stiffness of the joints. We must also consider the role of the teeth. While we often imagine ancient people with rotted, blackened stumps, the reality is quite different. Before the advent of agriculture and the introduction of high-sugar, starchy diets, human teeth were remarkably healthy. They were worn down by the grit of stone-ground food, yes, but cavities were rare. However, when a tooth did go bad, the pain was no less intense than it is today. We have found evidence in modern-day Pakistan of a Stone Age dentist who used tiny flint drills to remove decayed tissue from teeth as far back as 9,000 years ago. In other parts of the world, we find fillings made of beeswax used to seal a cracked tooth and protect the sensitive nerve from the air. They used the resin of the mastic tree or the numbing juice of the poppy to dull the throb. They were gardeners of the body, constantly weeding out the rot and pruning the broken parts to ensure the whole tree could continue to grow. As you listen to these words, perhaps you can feel the ancient connection to your own body. You are not a fragile creature of the modern age. You are the result of millions of years of successful healing. Every scar on your skin is a testament to the processes that were perfected in the caves and the forests. Your blood knows how to clot because of the lessons learned by the first hunters. Your bones know how to knit because of the care provided by the first midwives. The world of our ancestors was a world of high stakes, but it was not a world of hopelessness. It was a world where every plant had a name and a purpose, where the rhythm of the seasons was the rhythm of health, and where no one was left to heal alone. They survived because they were masters of their environment, turning the very things that could kill them, the sharp stone, the bitter root, the freezing cold, into the tools of their salvation. The fire is burning lower now, the embers turning from orange to a deep, resonant red. The air in our cave is still, but the story is far from over. As we move from the physical body to the broader world, we will begin to see how the first settlements and the dawn of farming changed the rules of survival forever. New diseases would emerge, born from the close proximity of animals and the settling of the dust. The golden age of the hunter-gatherer's health was about to face its greatest challenge. Stay in the space of rest. Let the knowledge of your ancestors' resilience settle into your bones. You are safe. You are strong. You are part of a long, unbroken chain of survivors. In the next part, we will explore the transition into the Neolithic, the mystery of the first plagues, and the strange, beautiful ways that the healers of the first cities tried to keep the world from falling apart. But for now, just breathe. Listen to the wind outside the cave, knowing that the walls are thick and the hearth is warm. The wisdom of the willow and the strength of the stone are with you. The ice is retreating. Imagine the slow, majestic melting of the great glaciers that once covered half the world. The climate of the Earth is shifting, softening, breathing a long, warm sigh across the continents. The endless, freezing steppes are giving way to lush, green valleys. The mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros fade into memory, and the herds of nimble deer and wild boar take their place in the forests. And with this monumental change in the weather comes the greatest revolution in the history of human survival. We are leaving the deep, echoing caves. We are walking out into the sunlit plains, and for the first time in our existence, we are deciding to stop walking. We are putting down roots. This is the dawn of the Neolithic age, the birth of agriculture. Picture a landscape in the ancient Near East, the cradle of civilization. The sun is setting, casting long, golden shadows over a cluster of square, mud-brick houses built so closely together that they share walls. There are no streets here. The people walk across the flat roofs and enter their homes through a hole in the ceiling, descending a wooden ladder into a space smelling of dried earth, roasting grain, and the musky scent of animals. This is a place like Çatalhöyük or ancient Jericho. It is the beginning of the city. But while settling down offered protection from the wild beasts of the forest, it introduced a terrifying new predator, one that could not be fought with a spear or driven away by a fire. When we look at the bones of the early hunter-gatherers, we see elite athletes. But when we examine the remains of the first farmers, a different, more somber story emerges. The transition to settled life was a shock to the human body. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had eaten a wildly diverse diet of hundreds of different plants, nuts, seeds, and lean meats. Now, the diet narrowed drastically. The early farmers relied on a handful of staple crops: wheat, barley, millet. While these grains provided a steady, predictable source of calories, they lacked the complex, broad-spectrum nutrition of the wild. We begin to see the first signs of dietary stress etched into the skeletons of these ancient city dwellers. We see a condition called porotic hyperostosis, where the bone of the skull becomes spongy and porous, a telltale sign of chronic anemia and iron deficiency. We see the teeth, once pristine and worn flat by rough food, now bearing the dark, hollowed-out cavities caused by a diet rich in carbohydrates, which turn to sugar in the mouth. The healers of the early settlements found themselves facing entirely new ailments. They were no longer just treating the acute injuries of the hunt. They were treating the slow, creeping illnesses of malnutrition. How did they cope? They adapted. The ancient healers, who were once foragers roaming vast territories to find the right root or leaf, became the first botanists. They began to cultivate medicinal gardens alongside their crops of wheat. They brought the wild pharmacy into the village walls. They planted the opium poppy, a beautiful, delicate flower that holds within its sticky sap one of the most powerful pain relievers known to humanity: morphine. They did not understand the alkaloids, but they understood that a carefully measured drop of poppy tea could bring sleep to a patient writhing in the agony of a broken bone, or soothe the relentless coughing fits that echoed through the dusty, crowded houses. They planted garlic and onions, not just for flavor, but because they intuitively recognized their powerful antimicrobial properties. Garlic contains allicin, a compound that is released when the clove is crushed, which can fight off a startling variety of bacteria and fungi. In the close quarters of an ancient village, where an infection could spread like wildfire from one family to the next, garlic was a daily shield. They would crush it, steep it in oil, and apply it to wounds, or consume it raw to ward off the sicknesses that seemed to ride on the winter winds. But the most profound challenge of the new settled life came from the very creatures that provided the farmers with their wealth. For the first time, humans were living in close, intimate contact with domesticated animals. Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs were kept in pens right outside the doors, and sometimes brought inside during the harsh winters to share the warmth of the hearth. This proximity created an invisible bridge. Diseases that had previously only circulated among animals suddenly found an opportunity to leap across the species barrier into humans. This is the origin of the great zoonotic diseases, the illnesses that would haunt humanity for thousands of years. The virus that caused rinderpest in cattle mutated and became measles in humans. The pathogens of pigs and ducks combined to create the first strains of influenza. Tuberculosis, the slow, wasting disease, likely crossed over from herds of cattle. And smallpox, one of the most devastating scourges in history, is believed to have originated from a similar virus in camels or rodents. Imagine the terror of the first outbreaks. A child develops a strange, blistering rash. A fever sweeps through the tightly packed mud brick homes. The old herbs, the willow bark and the yarrow, seem powerless against this new, invisible demon. In these moments, the survival of the village depended on the birth of a new concept: public health and quarantine. Long before the invention of the microscope or the discovery of germ theory, ancient communities developed a deeply instinctual understanding of contagion. They observed that the sickness spread from person to person, from breath to breath, and so they made the agonizing but necessary decision to separate the sick from the healthy. They created designated healing huts on the outskirts of the settlement. The caregivers, often those who had survived the illness themselves and were now mysteriously immune, would tend to the afflicted, bringing them water, broth, and the comforting chants of the spirits. By physically breaking the chain of transmission, these early societies managed to survive outbreaks that could have easily wiped out their entire population. They also began to recognize the vital importance of water management. In a nomadic hunter-gatherer band, waste was simply left behind as the group moved on. But in a permanent village of several hundred or thousand people, waste accumulates. If it contaminates the drinking water, the result is dysentery and cholera. The early city dwellers, through trial and error and the harsh lessons of disease, learned to dig deep wells for drawing clean water, completely separate from the areas where they washed their clothes or discarded their refuse. This simple act, the spatial separation of clean water from contaminated waste, saved more lives than any herb or surgical procedure of the time. It was an act of communal medicine, a recognition that the health of the individual was inextricably linked to the environment of the group. As we drift further into the history of these early settlements, we see a shift in the nature of medicine itself. It begins to transition from the purely oral traditions of the shaman to something more systematized. In the later part of the Neolithic, as villages grew into towns and towns grew into the first great city-states of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, we see the dawn of writing. And among the very first things that humanity felt compelled to record on clay tablets were the remedies for illness. These early medical texts are a fascinating blend of the practical and the magical. A prescription might list specific effective herbs to be ground with honey and applied to a wound, followed immediately by an incantation to drive out the disease demon that had taken up residence in the patient's liver. We might smile at the magic, but to the ancient mind, the physical and the spiritual were one and the same. If you had a fever, it was because the body was out of balance, yes, but it was also because you had offended a river spirit or broken a social taboo. Healing required addressing both the flesh and the soul. Let the image of the mud brick village slowly fade from your mind's eye. Replace it with the vast starry sky of the ancient desert. Feel the cool night air that brings relief after a blistering day. The transition to agriculture was a difficult, painful crucible for the human body. But it was a crucible that we survived. We learned to cultivate our medicines, we learned to manage the invisible threats of the crowd, and we began to write down the wisdom of the ages so that it would never be lost. In the quiet of this moment, as you rest in the modern world, consider the incredible resilience of your own biology. Your immune system is a library that contains the memory of every plague, every fever, and every invisible battle your ancestors fought and won in those dusty, sun-baked villages. You are the triumphant result of thousands of years of adaptation. In the next part of our journey, we will follow the rivers down into the fertile valleys of the great empires. We will walk the halls of ancient Egyptian temples, where the priests acted as physicians, and explore the strange, complex concoctions they used to cheat death. We will learn about the first specialized doctors, the eye doctors, the tooth pullers, the bone setters, and the incredible lengths they went to understand the mysterious clockwork of the human body. For now, allow your breathing to match the slow, steady rhythm of the ancient world. There is no rush here. The stars are moving across the sky at their own ancient pace, just as they did over the roofs of Jericho and Çatalhöyük. The struggles of the day are done. The village is sleeping. The watchfires are burning low, keeping the dark at bay. Sink deeply into the comfort of the present, held safe by the towering strength of the past. Let the dusty winds of the early settlements fade. Let the mud brick walls dissolve into the vast golden sands of a new era. We are traveling forward in time, following the water. Imagine the slow, heavy, majestic flow of the river Nile. The water is a deep, ribboning blue, cutting a path of vibrant, lush green through the endless, scorched expanse of the Sahara Desert. Listen to the rhythmic, hypnotic creak of the wooden water wheels, the sakia, slowly turning, lifting the life-giving water into the irrigation canals. Here, under the blazing sun of antiquity, humanity is building monuments that will defy time itself. And in the shadows of these rising pyramids and colossal temples, the art of survival is transforming into the science of medicine. Welcome to ancient Egypt. It is a world where the line between the physical and the spiritual is not just blurred, it does not exist. Health, to the ancient Egyptian mind, was a state of ma'at, a profound cosmic balance, a harmony between the body, the soul, the gods, and the universe. Illness was a disruption of this harmony. It was an intrusion, often viewed as the work of an angry deity, an unquiet ghost, or a malignant spirit that had taken root in the flesh. To cure a disease meant driving out the intruder and restoring the sacred balance. If you were to fall ill in the city of Thebes some 3,500 years ago, you would not go to a sterile clinic. You would go to the Per Ankh, the House of Life. These were institutions attached to the great temples, acting as a combination of library, university, and hospital. Imagine walking into the cool, dark stone halls, seeking refuge from the punishing desert sun. The air is thick with the fragrant, intoxicating smoke of myrrh, frankincense, and kifi incense. You hear the low, rhythmic chanting of the priests, their voices echoing off walls covered in intricate painted hieroglyphs. Here you would encounter the first true medical professionals in recorded history, and they were highly specialized. The Greek historian Herodotus would later marvel at the Egyptian medical system, writing that the country swarmed with medical practitioners. There was not just one general healer. There was a doctor for the eyes, a doctor for the teeth, a doctor for the belly, and even a title that translates roughly to the shepherd of the anus, the world's first proctologists. This specialization speaks to a society that had moved beyond mere survival and had the resources and the time to deeply observe the intricacies of the human form. Among these healers, one name echoes across the millennia, ascending from the ranks of mortality to become a god of healing himself: Imhotep. Living around 2600 BC, Imhotep was the vizier to the pharaoh Djoser, an architect who designed the first step pyramid, but he was also a legendary physician. Long before the Greek Hippocrates, Imhotep was diagnosing and treating over 200 different diseases. He understood that the broken spine led to paralysis of the legs, recording the observation with a chilling clinical detachment, an ailment not to be treated. He represents the moment when medicine began to rely on observation and logic, standing side by side with magic and prayer. To understand how they treated the sick, we must look at their books, not books of paper, but massive scrolls of woven reeds. The most famous of these is the Ebers Papyrus. Imagine a scroll over 60 feet long, covered in careful red and black ink. It is an ancient medical encyclopedia, a compilation of centuries of trial, error, and observation. It contains over 800 prescriptions and remedies. What did the ancient Egyptian medicine cabinet look like? It was a vast, sprawling collection of the flora, fauna, and minerals of the Nile Valley. They used castor oil as a purgative. They used aloe vera to soothe burns and skin conditions. They used willow bark, continuing the ancient tradition of pain relief we saw in the Stone Age. They recognized the power of copper salts, derived from the green mineral malachite, which they also used as eye makeup, as a potent antibacterial agent, rubbing it into wounds to prevent infection. But their greatest medical ally remained honey. The Ebers Papyrus mentions honey in hundreds of remedies. They mixed it with lint and animal grease to pack deep wounds. They blended it with herbs to soothe a coughing throat. They even created a complex poultice of moldy bread and honey to treat infected cuts. While it might sound like a recipe for disaster to a modern mind, the ancient healers had inadvertently stumbled upon a profound secret. The moldy bread produced penicillin thousands of years before Alexander Fleming would discover it in a modern laboratory, while the honey provided an osmotic, sterile environment that promoted tissue growth. It was a primitive, messy, yet incredibly effective form of antibiotic therapy. Yet, despite their clinical observations, magic remained the foundation of the cure. A prescription in the Ebers Papyrus for a burn does not just list the ingredients, it commands the healer to recite a specific incantation. Thy son Horus is burned in the desert. Is there any water there? There is no water, but I have water in my mouth, and a Nile between my thighs to extinguish the fire. The medicine was the physical tool. The word was the power that activated it. The placebo effect, wrapped in the absolute, unshakable faith of the patient, was a vital component of the healing process. It is often assumed that the Egyptian practice of mummification gave them an advanced understanding of human anatomy. The truth is more complex. The embalmers who removed the organs to preserve the shell of the body were a different caste entirely from the physicians, and their anatomical map was fundamentally flawed by modern standards. They believed the heart, not the brain, was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and the soul. When they mummified a pharaoh, they carefully preserved the heart, but they used an iron hook to pull the brain out through the nose and discarded it, considering it merely a stuffing to keep the skull's shape. However, this constant exposure to the inner workings of the body did give them a rudimentary understanding of the cardiovascular system. They recognized that the heart was the center of a network of vessels. They called these vessels metu. They believed that the metu carried not just blood, but air, water, tears, and even the invisible spirits of disease. A doctor's job was often described as measuring the heart, taking the pulse to determine if the metu were blocked, much like an irrigation canal clogged with silt. Now, let us leave the banks of the Nile and travel east, crossing the harsh, shimmering deserts of the Sinai, until we reach another land of two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is Mesopotamia, the land of ancient Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. Here, under the shadow of the massive terraced ziggurats, a different medical tradition was taking shape, written not on fragile papyrus, but pressed into eternal clay. Listen to the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of a wooden stylus pressing wedge-shaped cuneiform marks into a wet clay tablet. The Mesopotamian approach to medicine was highly organized, bureaucratic, and distinctly dualistic. If you fell ill in ancient Babylon, you had two options. You could summon the Asu, the physician. The Asu was a master of the physical world. He was an herbalist, a pharmacist, and a surgeon. He would grind mustard seed, salt, and pulverized turtle shell into a plaster to draw out an infection. He would wash wounds with beer and hot water, an accidental but effective method of sterilization. But if the Asu's physical remedies failed, it meant the root of the illness was not of this world. It was time to call the Ashipu, the exorcist. The Mesopotamians believed that diseases were demons. A terrible fever was the demon Lamashtu. A grinding headache was the work of the wind demon Pazuzu. The Ashipu did not use herbs. He used rituals, amulets, and incantations. He would attempt to trick the disease demon out of the patient's body and into a surrogate, perhaps a clay figurine or a live pig, which would then be destroyed or driven away. Often the Asu and the Ashipu worked together, treating the flesh and the spirit simultaneously, covering all possible bases of the unknown. Mesopotamia also gives us one of the most remarkable documents in the history of human survival, the Code of Hammurabi, dating to around 1750 BC. Carved into a massive stele of black diorite, this code of law provides a fascinating and somewhat terrifying glimpse into the life of an ancient surgeon. It contains the first known medical malpractice laws. The laws were strict, based on the principle of an eye for an eye. If a physician performed a major surgery with a bronze lancet and saved the life of a nobleman, he was paid 10 shekels of silver, a small fortune. But if the surgeon's hand slipped and the nobleman died or lost his eye during a procedure, the punishment was brutal. They shall cut off his hand. This extreme accountability tells us two things. First, surgery was happening, and it was complex enough to warrant specific laws. Second, to be a surgeon in ancient Babylon required nerves of absolute steel. You were gambling your own body against the life of your patient. As the night deepens over the ancient river valleys, let the profound silence of the desert wash over you. The healers of Egypt and Mesopotamia did not have microscopes. They did not have MRIs, and they did not know about bacteria. They were navigating a dark room, feeling their way forward with their hands, their herbs, and their prayers. Yet they laid the foundation for everything that was to come. They taught us to observe, to record, to specialize, and to seek balance. They remind us that the human desire to heal, to alleviate suffering, and to cheat the darkness of death is as old as civilization itself. We have always fought for each other. We have always looked at the broken pieces of our fragile bodies and believed that somehow we could put them back together. In the next part of our long journey, we will cross the glittering Mediterranean Sea. We will walk among the marble columns of ancient Greece, where a man named Hippocrates will challenge the gods and declare that disease is not a curse, but a natural process. We will march with the Roman legions and discover how the brutal machinery of war created the most advanced surgical hospitals the ancient world had ever seen. For now, release the tension in your own body. Feel the slow, steady rhythm of your heart, a muscle that has been recognized and revered since the dawn of time. You are safe. The waters of the river are flowing. The stars of the ancient sky are watching over you, guiding you toward a deep, untroubled rest. The desert winds of the east now give way to the gentle, salty breeze of the Mediterranean. Imagine the deep, crystalline blue of the Aegean Sea crashing softly against shores lined with silver-green olive trees. we are arriving in ancient Greece, a land where philosophy and physical existence began to weave together into a new understanding of the universe. In this sun-drenched landscape, the approach to healing took two distinct yet parallel paths: the divine sleep of the temples and the birth of rational medicine. Let us first walk into the sacred sanctuary of Epidaurus, the center of healing dedicated to Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. The air here is different. It is peaceful, heavy with the scent of pine and the distant sea. For hundreds of years, the sick and the weary traveled across mountains and oceans to reach this place, seeking a cure not from a surgical blade, but from the quiet realm of dreams. This practice was known as incubation. A patient would purify themselves with sacred spring water, make an offering, and then lie down to sleep in the Adaptation, a long, open-air portico designed specifically for rest. Imagine lying there as the Greek sun dips below the horizon, surrounded by hundreds of other sleeping souls. The priests release non-venomous snakes, the sacred symbol of Asclepius, whose shedding skin represented renewal and healing, to slither quietly among the sleepers. In the deep, silent hours of the night, the patient would hope for a dream. They believed the god would visit them in their slumber, either miraculously curing them before dawn or whispering a cryptic riddle that the priests would interpret the next morning as a medical prescription. This was the ultimate manifestation of the mind-body connection. The sheer expectation of a cure, combined with profound relaxation, fasting, and a break from the stresses of daily life, triggered the body's natural restorative powers. The Greeks understood that sometimes the most profound medicine of all is simply a deep, untroubled sleep. But just a few islands away, on the rocky shores of Kos, a man was sitting under the shade of a massive plane tree, looking at the human body not as a playground for the gods, but as a part of the natural world. His name was Hippocrates. To the Hippocratic physicians, a disease was not a divine punishment, it was a physical process with physical causes. They believed the body was governed by the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. While this theory seems strangely poetic and entirely inaccurate today, it represented a monumental shift in human thought. If you were a patient of a Hippocratic doctor, you would not be given magical amulets. The doctor would sit beside you, taking meticulous notes. They would listen to your breathing, examine your skin, smell your breath, and ask detailed questions about your diet, your environment, and your emotions. They believed that nature was the ultimate healer. The doctor's role was merely to assist nature, to remove obstacles to healing. Their primary tools were not harsh interventions, but gentle corrections to a patient's lifestyle. A change in diet, the prescription of moderate exercise, the playing of soothing music, and the administration of mild herbal remedies. Above all, they swore an oath that echoes into modern hospitals today: primum non nocere. First, do no harm. As the centuries rolled forward, the intellectual light of Greece was absorbed by the expanding, organized might of the Roman Empire. Let the image of the quiet Greek temples fade, replaced by the rhythmic marching of sandals on paved stone roads and the massive, sweeping arches of the aqueducts. The Romans were supreme engineers, and they applied this mindset to the human body and public health with an efficiency the world had never seen. The Romans understood that an empire is only as strong as its soldiers. When the legions marched to the edges of the known world, from the mists of Britannia to the deserts of Syria, they brought their medicine with them. They constructed the valetudinaria, the first dedicated, purpose-built military hospitals. These were brilliant examples of architectural medicine. They were designed with long corridors and isolated rooms to prevent the spread of infection, with advanced drainage systems and abundant access to fresh water. In the gladiatorial arenas of Rome, physicians like the great Galen treated the horrific wounds of combat, gaining an unparalleled, albeit gruesome, education in human anatomy. Galen mapped the muscles, the nerves, and the arteries, realizing that the arteries carried blood, not just air, as had been previously thought. He learned how to tie off bleeding blood vessels, a technique that saved countless lives on the battlefield. Yet, Rome's greatest medical achievement was not a surgical technique or a new herb. It was water. The Romans realized that filth bred disease. They built the Cloaca Maxima, a massive sewer system to drain the swamps and carry human waste away from the city. They constructed majestic aqueducts, miles long, to bring millions of gallons of crystal-clear mountain water right into the heart of the metropolis. They built massive public baths where citizens of all classes could scrub away the grime of the city. Clean water, sanitation, and hygiene. These architectural marvels prevented more plagues and saved more lives than any medicine of antiquity. But what was happening on the other side of the world? Let us drift along the Great Silk Road, across the towering peaks of the Himalayas, and into the misty, verdant valleys of ancient China. Here, a medical tradition was flourishing that viewed the human body as a microscopic reflection of the universe itself. The ancient Chinese healers observed the constant flow and transformation of nature. They observed that rivers must flow to remain pure, that seasons must change in harmony. They applied this to the body, developing the concept of qi, the vital life force, and the balance of yin and yang. When a patient fell ill in ancient China, the physician would gently take their pulse, feeling not just the speed of the heartbeat, but the subtle, intricate rhythms of the body's internal energy pathways, known as meridians. If the qi was blocked, they would use incredibly fine needles, perhaps made of silver or gold, to stimulate specific points on the body. This is acupuncture, a practice that has survived for millennia. We now know through modern science that acupuncture can stimulate the nervous system, releasing endorphins, the body's natural painkillers, and altering pain processing in the brain. Alongside acupuncture, they cultivated a vast, incredibly complex pharmacopoeia, boiling roots, barks, and leaves like ginseng and ephedra into bitter, potent teas designed to restore harmony to a system out of balance. As we move forward through the river of time, we enter the shadowy quiet of the European Middle Ages. The great empires have fallen. The grand hospitals of Rome are ruins overgrown with ivy. But the knowledge of healing did not die. It retreated into the thick stone walls of the monasteries. Imagine a cold, quiet morning in a medieval abbey. The only sound is the scratching of a quill on parchment and the distant, haunting melody of Gregorian chant. Monks and nuns were the primary caretakers of the sick. In the cloister gardens, surrounded by protective stone walls, they carefully cultivated physic gardens filled with medicinal herbs. Rosemary for memory, lavender for calm, sage for digestion, and the potent, dangerous foxglove, which we now know contains digitalis, a powerful heart medication. Healers like the remarkable Hildegard of Bingen wrote extensive volumes on natural history and the curative properties of plants, emphasizing a holistic approach that combined physical remedies with spiritual purity. But this era also brought the greatest test of human survival the world had ever faced: the Black Death. When the bubonic plague swept across Eurasia in the 14th century, wiping out a vast percentage of the population, no herb, no prayer, and no ancient text could stop it. It was a time of unimaginable darkness and fear. Yet, even in the face of this apocalyptic horror, humanity survived. How? The answer lies deep within the silent, microscopic code of our bodies. Those who survived the plague did so because their immune systems, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary battles, managed to recognize and defeat the Yersinia pestis bacteria. The survivors passed on their resilient genes. Every person alive today, including you listening to this now, is a descendant of the strongest, most genetically robust humans who ever lived. You carry the legacy of their survival in your very DNA. And now, our long journey through time comes to an end. We have walked with the nomadic hunters who first harnessed fire and chewed the willow bark. We have stood beside the first surgeons who dared to cut into the skull with volcanic glass. We have seen the mud brick villages of the first farmers and the fragrant temple hospitals of ancient Egypt. We have felt the quiet pulse of the Chinese meridians and rested in the dream temples of the Greeks. Throughout all these ages, without modern antibiotics, without anesthesia, without machines that can see through flesh, early humans did not just suffer. They observed. They experimented. They cared for one another with fierce compassion. They used the earth, the water, the fire, and the mind as their pharmacy. Take a deep breath in. Fill your lungs with the air of the present moment. And as you exhale, let go of any lingering tension. You are resting in a safe place. You do not need to worry about the cold of the Ice Age or the dangers of the ancient forests. You are surrounded by the comforts and the miracles of the modern world. But inside you beats the exact same heart that powered the ancient hunters. Inside you flows the same blood that the Egyptian physicians studied. Your body is an ancient, beautiful, highly advanced healing machine, perfected by time and tempered by history. Let the shadows of the past gently recede. Let the fires of the ancient hearts fade into a soft, comforting warmth in your own chest. Your ancestors survived the darkness, and they have passed their strength down to you, unbroken across the millennia. There is nothing left to do now but rest. Let your body do what it has known how to do since the dawn of humanity. Let it repair. Let it restore. Let it heal in the quiet sanctuary of sleep. Drift down into the quiet. Drift down into peace.